Hey guys, we're going to talk about Andrew Jackson and we're going to do a real quick review. All right, so when we talk about Jackson, we're going to talk about Jacksonian democracy, what that means, what the Nullification Crisis was, his Native American policy, and the Bank War. We're going to start with the election of 1824. The election of 1824, Andrew Jackson runs for president against three other opponents. And this is the very first election where the popular vote is being taken. What that means is that's the people's vote. This is important because we're starting to see a trend in the 1820s of more people, more Americans getting involved in politics and having a say, where previously they didn't have the voice to choose their president at all. The candidates for the election are William Crawford, he's from the South, Henry Clay from the West, and he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams, who was the former President John Adams' son, and Andrew Jackson, a rising military hero from the West. Now, in the election to become the president, you not only, the popular vote shows how the people voted, but the electoral vote is who chooses, or is how we get our president. You have to have a majority or more than half of the electoral vote to win. So William Crawford is blue and Henry Clay is orange. And so you can see they have this lowest percentages. So Henry Clay came in last place, so he's definitely not going to become president. And William Crawford had 16%. He came in third place. However, he ended up getting sick and dropped out of the race at the end. So because neither Adams or Jackson had more than half of the electoral vote, then the House of Representatives is going to decide and choose who the president is. However, Henry Clay, remember, is Speaker of the House, and he had been part of running for president. So there are records of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay meeting and having conversations about, how are they going to ensure John Quincy Adams wins the presidency. So what Henry Clay is going to do is use his influence in the House and convince members to vote for John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams becomes the sixth president. Andrew Jackson loses, and he's super bitter about this. And Henry Clay will be rewarded and becomes the next Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams is our sixth president. However, Jackson is not very happy, and he claims that John Quincy Adams made a corrupt bargain, that he was a cheater, and he's coming back, and John Quincy Adams' presidency is pretty much tainted by this. In 1828, John Quincy Adams is running for president again, and this time, notice we have some parties involved next to their names, whereas before we were coming after the era of good feelings in 1824, we didn't have parties, but now the parties have returned. And Jackson is back, and he gets 56% of the popular vote and 68% of the electoral vote, winning the election of 1828 in a landslide. Andrew Jackson was very popular with the people. That's why there's a whole era named after him, the Jacksonian era. This is because we see a rise of the common man. The reason Jackson gets this named after him is because he appealed to the common man. He started from humble beginnings himself in his life and was a self-made man. And in addition, in the late 1820s, we saw states ending voting requirements, such as requiring people to own land. And white men are going to be able to vote without having to own property. So those are going to be a little bit lower class people. Andrew Jackson, during the election, he would go and campaign out in public and talk to the people, as you can see in this picture. So we're going to see the rise of the common man in politics. And in this picture, you may notice that, this is when Jackson's being sworn into office. There's quite a bit of people there to watch, but we also have some new type of guests. You might notice that there's a bucking horse, and that's showing you that some of the wild people from the West and lower class are showing up to be a part of politics now. Andrew Jackson is going to take this further with the spoil system. So he feels like people that supported him and helped him get elected, he wants them, for their loyalty, for them to get a reward. And this is called the spoil system, where he rewards supporters with government jobs, and he replaced nearly 1,000 government officials with people that he felt like were his supporters. In addition, Jackson had some issues with his cabinet members, so he had a group of unofficial cabinet advisors that would come and meet him and come through the White House kitchen cabinet, and that's why they call them the kitchen cabinet. All right, so first big issue is the Nullification Crisis. And the Nullification Crisis has to do with tariffs and Andrew Jackson squaring off against South Carolina and almost entering into a civil war. So in the year 1828, American tariffs were the highest they'd ever been. They were up to 50%. Southerners hated the tariff. They called it the tariff of abomination, something they loathed and hated. And the reason why is because Southerners relied on England to buy their cotton. England purchased at least over half of the South's cotton that was made. And so in return, Southerners would purchase foreign products from England. So that means who's paying the tariff? It's the Southerners. And so the Southerners are angry about this, and John C. Calhoun appeals to Jackson. And John C. Calhoun, who you see on the right side of the cartoon, he was the vice president at the time, and he knows that Jackson was a slave owner and plantation owner, and he feels like he will also equally be outraged by the tariff. But Jackson really isn't. He's going to enforce whatever the law is. So John C. Calhoun steps down as vice president, gets elected as a senator, and is going to lead the fight of states' rights. And John C. Calhoun is saying that states have the right to govern themselves, and if they feel the federal laws are unfair or unconstitutional, they have the right to nullify it. And in the cartoon, you can see on the ring, or actually down in the audience, you've got this guy, and I highlighted it yellow. He said, "Didn't we give the federal government its power?" Because the states did. The states gave the government the power they had, but that also meant the states were supposed to have some rights maintained. All right, so then if we look at Jackson's response, Jackson says South Carolina is going to have to obey this tariff. And he is going to use, there's going to be a new bill called the Force Bill, which will give him power to use the military to force South Carolina to pay the tariff. And if South Carolina secedes, which they threaten to, then he will prevent a civil war. And if you look down in the blue, it says, we can't cherry pick what laws we like. We are a federal republic. And so think of the danger of if states could pick and choose what laws they want to follow, then who's going to obey any of the federal laws? Anyways, Henry Clay comes in and saves the day, and he suggests that the tariff be lowered, and they compromise. And South Carolina backs down, and the crisis is avoided. So here's a quick little recap video of what I just talked about.
In the last episode of History Sci-Fi Theater, the North had come to love tariffs because they made people buy more American manufactured goods, while the South hated tariffs because they hurt trade with Europe. And now, this week's episode. In the dark recesses of his underground laboratory, Dr. Regional Division transmogrifies North-South tensions into the Tariff of Abominations.
It's alive!
Southerners fear the tariff.
Run for your lives!
It'll ruin our economy.
While Northerners don't mind it at all.
It's kind of cute, really.
What a sweetie.
Andrew Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, says the South has the right to secede or withdraw from the Union.
Either that thing goes or we go.
But President Jackson isn't having it.
You'll stay in the Union, whether you like it or not.
We'll not.
Will too.
Then lock up that monster.
By 1832, there were newer, even bigger tariffs, and the country was on the brink of civil war. When Jackson and Calhoun brought in respected statesman Henry Clay, who had previously developed the Missouri Compromise of 1820 to tame the beast.
I'll save the day. Unity is more important than tariffs.
And so a compromise was reached. Northerners accepted lower tariffs, and Southerners remained in the Union. Henry Clay had once again defeated the evil Dr. Regional Division. Or had he?
All right, so our next topic is the Indian removal policy. And so in the year 1830, Congress and President Jackson were in agreement. They wanted to move Native American tribes in the Southeast off their lands. The Indian Removal Act was going to authorize President Jackson to negotiate treaties that would remove the natives. And the 5 main tribes that we're talking about are the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, Seminoles, and the Cherokees. And they're going to be moved to the yellow area, which is present-day Oklahoma and some other states. And that was what was known as Indian Territory. However, Georgia had already been trying to get rid of Native Americans. They've been passing different laws to make life harder for Cherokees, trying to force them off. However, the Cherokees had white missionaries helping them, and they used the Supreme Court to try to resist leaving. Georgia, however, had passed a new law requiring whites to have special license to reside with the natives. The whole purpose of the law was to force missionaries out of Cherokee villages so they couldn't help them anymore. Samuel Worcester was a missionary, and he was arrested for living with the Cherokees without a license. So there was a Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia. And in this case, the Cherokees claimed that Georgia had no right to move the natives or make laws trying to move the natives because the natives were essentially a foreign country, a foreign nation. And that, according to the Constitution, only Congress, like federal Congress, could make laws or treaties that affected foreign nations. And the Supreme Court was ruled at the time by John Marshall. He was the Chief Justice, and I don't know if you recall, he was a Federalist, which means he believes in big federal government. And John Marshall agreed and said that Georgia couldn't move Indians because only the federal government could enter treaties with the Cherokees, and Georgia had to stop with their policies. However, Jackson doesn't force Georgia to obey the court, and Jackson even helps Georgia by sending 7,000 troops to evict the Cherokee Indians. And this is going to lead to a horrible time, which was known as the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was the forced removal of about 16,000 Cherokee Indians, and they were rounded up by federal troops at gunpoint, but they had bayonets on the end, so you could say bayonet point. And these Cherokees were put in stockades. They didn't have time to pack their belongings, and they had to go on a 1,000-mile trek. Most of them had to walk, and they had to go, like I said, on foot, and they didn't leave till late fall, early winter, so they had to go through really harsh weather. So about 4,000 of them died from either starvation or exhaustion or having to deal with the weather or disease. So the impact is about 46,000 natives were relocated during this time period, opening up 25 million acres of land where whites are going to take over Indian territory, and this will also open it up to the expansion of slavery and cotton farming. Okay, so the last topic is the Bank of the United States. So President Jackson hates the Bank of the United States. He thinks the Bank of the United States is corrupt and undemocratic, and he is going to target Nicholas Biddle in this bank war, as we call it. Now, Henry Clay, along with many other people, know that Jackson doesn't like the Bank of the United States, and Henry Clay is going to run for president in 1832 against Jackson, so he decides that he wants to make a big issue in the next election, and he is going to try to renew the bank's charter or contract early. Now, if Jackson doesn't agree, it doesn't matter because the United States government still has a contract with the bank, but Henry Clay just feels like if he renews the charter early, and Jackson vetoes it, which he does, then the American people are going to find out and be angry, and they're going to choose Henry Clay in the election. Well, that doesn't happen. In the election of 1832, Henry Clay, he's the brown, he gets 17% of the electoral vote, and Jackson gets 77%, and Jackson wins again in another landslide. Jackson, however, is still going to target the bank, and the bank actually prints paper money, so Jackson's going to order for gold and silver to be used to purchase federal lands. He wants to get funds moved from the Bank of the United States into specific state banks or his pet banks, and secretaries of Treasury, multiple, wouldn't do it, so he fired multiple people until one would do it. Jackson's critics claim that he was acting like a tyrant and an abusive bad king, and the critics will form the Whig Party to oppose him. And the Whig Party was the name of a party in England that opposed the King of England. If you look at the cartoon, you'll notice that Jackson looks like a king. He's dressed like a king. He has the power of veto in his hand. He's stepping on the Constitution. He's stepping on the Bank of the United States, which says internal improvements, meaning that's where money would have been for that. And then also on the ground is the judiciary of the United States because Jackson didn't support the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia. He opposed it and went against it. All right, so that's it. Just answer the questions that went with the video and turn it into Canvas. Bye.